Have you ever watched a movie so wild, so surreal, you questioned if the filmmakers were sane or simply possessed by imagination itself? The 1980s were a decade of unrestrained fantasy where rubber monsters ruled and logic was optional. Studios gambled on dreams, nightmares, and cosmic jokes. Some failed, others became cult legends. These are 15 fantasy films from the 80s that make no sense, but you cannot look away. Number 15. Krull, 1983. When audiences first saw Krull, they expected a standard heroic quest. What they got was a kaleidoscopic mix of sword and sorcery, space warfare, and interdimensional creatures. The film opened with a cosmic fortress floating through space, landing on a medieval planet. Inside, the monstrous beast prepared to conquer worlds. A prince and his chosen bride stood between peace and annihilation, armed with a mystical spinning blade called the glaive. Krull was meant to rival Star Wars and Conan, yet it baffled critics. It tried to fuse laser battles with knights on horseback. One scene featured alien slugs, another looked like a Renaissance painting. The story looped between myth and science fiction without reason. Director Peter Yates, known for Bullitt, seemed unsure whether he was making a space opera or a fairy tale. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. Sets at Pinewood Studios flooded. Creatures melted under the lights. The budget ballooned beyond control. Columbia Pictures panicked, but it was too late. The film bombed, leaving audiences scratching their heads. Still, the visual ambition and James Horner's haunting score gained a cult following decades later. Today, Krull is remembered as a glorious disaster, a fever dream from an era when studios still dared to lose money on imagination. Number 14. The Never-Ending Story. 2. The Next Chapter, 1990. By the time this sequel arrived, fans of the original were desperate for magic again. What they got instead felt like a dream gone sour. The Never-Ending Story, the 2, tried to expand the universe of Fantasia, but instead collapsed under its own weight. The story followed Bastian once again diving into the book that controlled his fate, only to find his memories literally being stolen by an evil sorceress called Zaid. The concept was brilliant. Yet the execution was bewildering. Characters appeared, then vanished. Entire sequences seemed improvised. Even the iconic dragon Falkor looked oddly different due to a redesigned puppet. Production troubles haunted the film from the start. Original director Wolfgang Petersen refused to return, calling the script hollow. The new German crew struggled to match the emotional tone of the first movie. When it hit theaters, critics shredded it, calling it mechanical and lifeless. Fans who grew up with the original felt betrayed. Yet children of the VHS era found themselves watching it repeatedly. Maybe because beneath the chaos lay something haunting about memory loss and growing up. It became a cult film for kids who never forgot the feeling of being trapped between fantasy and reality. The Never-Ending Story, the 2, still stands as proof that sequels can lose their way, yet accidentally capture a strange truth about childhood. The moment when wonder begins to fade. Number 13. The Ice Pirates, 1984. In the middle of the sci-fi boom came a film so absurd it could only have been made in the 80s. The Ice Pirates told the story of space smugglers stealing ice because in the distant future, water had become the most valuable substance in the galaxy. The heroes wore chainmail, the villains rode robotic camels, and time travel somehow entered halfway through. What began as satire turned into lunacy. The production started serious, but when funding dropped, the studio demanded a comedy instead. Costumes from other MGM films were recycled. Robots malfunctioned mid-scene. Director Stuart Raffle later admitted he had no idea what genre he was making. The result felt like a parody of itself long before it ended. Censors almost intervened over violent gags involving exploding androids and an infamous sequence where the characters age rapidly during a space warp. Test audiences laughed for the wrong reasons. Critics destroyed it. Yet years later, the Ice Pirates resurfaced on cable television and developed a cult of believers who saw its madness as brilliance. Its legacy lies in defiance. The Ice Pirates dared to turn desperation into art. It failed gloriously, yet captured the spirit of the 80s. When even disaster looked like adventure. Number 12. Legend, 1985. When Ridley Scott turned from outer space terror to fairy tale fantasy, he created something that looked like a dream, but felt like a riddle. Legend followed a young forest dweller named Jack, who must rescue Princess Lily from the Lord of Darkness before he destroys the last unicorns and plunges the world into night. What unfolded was pure cinematic sorcery, both mesmerizing and confusing beyond belief. Shot entirely on sound stages at Pinewood Studios, the film turned myth into glittering chaos. Fog hung over every frame, costumes shimmered, dialogue sounded like it was whispered through water. Tom Cruise, still new to fame, played Jack with innocent intensity, while Tim Curry's transformation into the Horned Demon became one of cinema's most unforgettable images. Yet audiences could barely follow the story. Ridley Scott cut multiple versions, trying to please both American and European distributors. Test audiences complained it was too slow, too strange, too dark. Universal Pictures ordered new music by Tangerine Dream, replacing Jerry Goldsmith's majestic orchestral score. Critics were divided. Some hailed it as visual poetry, others called it a soulless hallucination. Then tragedy struck. A fire burned down the main set just before completion. The production limped forward on smaller stages. When the film finally opened, it flopped. But over decades, its reputation grew. Fans of dark fantasy discovered it on VHS and declared it the ultimate 80s fairy tale, where innocence and nightmare danced side by side. Legend remains a paradox, a film that makes no sense, but feels like a dream you never want to end. Number 11. Masters of the Universe, 1987. It was supposed to be the next Star Wars. Instead, it became a glorious mess of cosmic proportions. Masters of the Universe took the beloved He-Man cartoon and turned it into a live-action odyssey no one could quite explain. The film followed He-Man and his allies as they traveled from the magical world of Eternia to modern-day Earth, thanks to a malfunctioning cosmic key that looked like a space accordion. Dolph Lundgren swung his sword like a warrior, born from marble, while Frank Langella delivered Shakespearean speeches under Skeletor's skull mask. The plot, however, barely made sense. Characters teleported between worlds for no reason. A teenage couple got involved in a galactic war. Budget cuts forced entire scenes to be dropped mid-shoot. Behind the scenes, Canon Films was collapsing financially. Sets were reused. Crew members worked without pay. The final battle had to be filmed in a dark room because the studio literally ran out of money for lights. When it hit theaters, critics mocked it mercilessly. Yet children who loved the toys watched it endlessly on cable. Decades later, Masters of the Universe gained cult status. Fans saw beauty in its ambition and chaos. Langella himself called Skeletor his favorite role. The movie endures because it captures something raw about 80s fantasy. Heroes shouting destiny in the face of disaster. Number 10. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, 1988. Few films in history have burned brighter and fallen harder than Terry Gilliam's The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. A dazzling carnival of imagination, it told the story of an old adventurer who claims he once traveled to the moon, outran death, and swallowed a cannonball. It was a spectacle of flying ships, volcano gods, and philosophical jokes, but logic was left far behind. The film's production became legend for its chaos. Budgets spiraled from 30 to 40 million, then beyond. Shooting in Italy dragged on for months. Gilliam's perfectionism clashed with studio executives who feared financial ruin. Columbia Pictures panicked and cut marketing to almost nothing. When the movie premiered, only a handful of theaters showed it. Critics called it brilliant madness. Others dismissed it as self-indulgent nonsense. The public ignored it entirely. Gilliam called the experience a nightmare, but stood by the vision. The film's visual effects were astonishing for their time-blending miniatures and handmade illusions rather than digital tricks. Over time, Baron Munchausen found redemption. Film scholars praised it as one of the last great handmade fantasies before CGI took over. It speaks to the human urge to tell stories bigger than life itself, no matter how impossible they seem. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen remains both triumph and tragedy, a dream too vast for the world that birthed it. Number 9. The Company of Wolves, 1984. Neil Jordan's The Company of Wolves looked like a gothic fairy tale, but it moved like a fevered dream that no one could explain. Inspired by Angela Carter's haunting short stories, it reimagined Little Red Riding Hood as a nightmare of adolescence, transformation, and primal fear. The film blurred the line between myth and nightmare until audiences were unsure what was real And what was memory? It opened in England to both fascination and outrage. The imagery was lush forest painted in deep red and fog. Wolves tore from human skins. Dolls whispered in candlelight. Each story folded into another. Viewers tried to decode it, but logic dissolved. For some, it was an allegory about innocence. For others, it was pure chaos, filmed through desire and dread. Production was difficult from the start. Low budgets forced the crew to use recycled sets and miniature forests. The elaborate transformation sequences pushed makeup effects to the limit. Critics compared it to a living painting, yet distributors feared it would alienate mainstream audiences. In America, it was released quietly, almost hidden from theaters. But like a secret whispered in the dark, the film found new life on video shelves. Horror fans adored its poetic tone. Feminist critics celebrated its subversive retelling of patriarchal myths. Today, it stands as one of the strangest and most hypnotic fantasies of the 80s, a dark reminder that fairy tales were never meant for children. Number 8. Highlander, 1986. There can be only one. That tagline echoed through pop culture, but few remember how wild and confusing the original Highlander truly was. The movie opened with a sword fight in a New York parking garage, then revealed the hero Connor MacLeod was a centuries-old immortal warrior from medieval Scotland, hunted by others like him through time. The film jumped across eras with no explanation. Flashbacks crashed into rock concerts. Sean Connery appeared as a Spanish-Egyptian mentor despite his thick Scottish accent. The story defied logic, but pulsed with energy. Director Russell Mulcahy came from music videos and filled every frame with neon fog and lightning. During production, financiers interfered constantly. The original cut ran over 3 hours and made no sense. Editors hacked it down to under 2. Queen's soundtrack thundered over the chaos, turning scenes into accidental music videos. When it premiered, critics were brutal, calling it incoherent. The box office disappointed. Yet, something strange happened on home video. Viewers replayed it obsessively. Its line "there can be only one" became iconic. The mythology spawned sequels, television shows, and novels, none of which matched the raw mythic energy of the original. Highlander survives because of its contradictions, a film that broke its own rules, yet somehow felt immortal. Number 7. Return to Oz, 1985. When Disney decided to revisit the Land of Oz, it created one of the most unsettling children's movies ever made. Return to Oz followed young Dorothy, this time played by Fairuza Balk, as she returned to a world far darker than the Technicolor dream her parents knew. The Emerald City lay in ruins. The yellow brick road was cracked. The Scarecrow was missing. From its opening scene in a Kansas mental hospital, audiences realized this was no cheerful sequel. Dorothy is nearly given electroshock therapy before escaping into Oz through a lightning storm. What she finds is nightmare made real. Headless witches with shelves of screaming faces, mechanical men with ticking hearts, and the terrifying wheelers who screech across ruined streets. Executives panicked once they saw the tone. The film tested horribly with families expecting a musical adventure. Disney delayed release and trimmed scenes, but the damage was done. Critics were divided between admiration for its craftsmanship and horror at its darkness. Behind the scenes, director Walter Murch, known as an editor, not a storyteller, nearly lost his job several times. Even George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola visited the set to save production. Despite its failure at the box office, the film became a cult legend. Return to Oz endures because it captures a forgotten truth about fantasy, that wonder and terror are twins. It makes no sense as a children's film, yet it speaks directly to the child who has seen too much of the real world. Number 6. Labyrinth, 1986. When Jim Henson joined forces with George Lucas and David Bowie, the result was destined to be either genius or madness. Labyrinth was both. It told the story of Sarah, a teenage girl who wishes her baby brother away and must journey through a maze of puppets, illusions, and strange creatures to bring him back from the Goblin King. What sounds simple unfolds like a dream that refuses to follow its own rules. Every corridor of the labyrinth defies reason. Rooms rotate, talking doors argue about logic. Time bends and the walls themselves sing. Henson filled the screen with hundreds of animatronic puppets, but it was Bowie's mesmerizing presence that transformed the film into legend. His music enchanted some and baffled others. Was it a children's fantasy or an art rock opera? No one knew. Production was a nightmare of ambition. Puppets jammed their mechanisms. The baby cried through key scenes. Budget overruns terrified the studio. Test audiences left confused, unsure whether to laugh or hide. When it premiered, critics dismissed it as incoherent. The movie barely made back its cost. But then came the video era. Generation after generation found it again and felt its magic. The combination of Henson's puppetry and Bowie's haunting songs created something timeless. Labyrinth became a monument to imagination unbound by logic, a dream built by artists who refused to follow rules. Number 5. The Dark Crystal, 1982. Before Labyrinth, Jim Henson and Frank Oz tried something even stranger. The Dark Crystal was their attempt to build an entire alien world without a single human actor. Set on the dying planet of Thra, it followed Jen, a young gelfling, on a quest to heal the shattered Dark Crystal and restore balance between the gentle mystics and the cruel Skeksis. Every frame was handmade. Every creature moved through complex puppetry and animatronics. The story, however, was cryptic, filled with invented languages and ancient prophecies. Early audiences were lost. Some children cried, others were transfixed. Critics argued it was too dark for kids, too childish for adults. The studio executives grew anxious after test screenings where parents walked out. Universal debated cutting entire scenes, but Henson refused. He believed fantasy should not be explained but felt. The film underperformed, yet gradually built an army of admirers who saw in it a deeper message about corruption, power, and harmony. Years later, The Dark Crystal inspired books, art, and even a Netflix prequel. What once seemed incomprehensible became sacred to fans of world-building and puppetry. It remains a testament to the power of imagination, proof that even confusion can be beautiful when shaped by pure creative conviction. Number 4. Xanadu, 1980. Few films define the word bewildering like Xanadu. This musical fantasy attempted to merge ancient Greek mythology with roller disco. The plot followed a frustrated artist who meets a muse, played by Olivia Newton-John, who helps him open a roller rink under the guidance of a mysterious immortal Gene Kelly. The result was a neon explosion of music, skating, and divine nonsense. From the moment it began, audiences were unsure what they were seeing. One minute, Greek muses danced out of murals, the next, electric guitars roared under strobe lights. Dialogue felt improvised. The tone swung wildly between mythic prophecy and nightclub comedy. Behind the scenes, Universal executives had no idea how to market it. Was it a romance, a fantasy, a musical, or all three? Production delays mounted as choreography collided with experimental lighting. When it premiered, critics shredded it, calling it absurd and incoherent. Yet over time, the very qualities that doomed it turned it into a cult masterpiece. The soundtrack by Electric Light Orchestra soared to platinum sales. Midnight screenings revived it as a camp classic. People who once mocked it later found joy in its unapologetic weirdness. Xanadu stands today as a glittering paradox, a movie that failed because it dreamed too loudly. It makes no sense, but it glows with the spirit of an era when fantasy meant never apologizing for excess. Number 3. The Last Unicorn, 1982. Animated fantasy in the 80s often walked a thin line between wonder and despair, but none more so than The Last Unicorn. Directed by Jules Bass and Arthur Rankin Jr., this haunting film told the story of a unicorn who discovers she may be the last of her kind. Her journey to find the others turns into an odyssey through melancholy, magic, and madness. The animation glowed like a watercolor dream, yet the tone was unsettling. Characters spoke in riddles. The story shifted between whimsy and sorrow. A drunken magician named Schmendrick, a bitter bandit's wife named Molly Grew, and the terrifying Red Bull who drove the unicorns into the sea. All seemed pulled from a strange fairy tale for adults disguised as a children's film. When it premiered, audiences were stunned. The dialogue felt too philosophical for children, but too innocent for grown-ups. Critics called it beautiful, yet disorienting. The studio behind it faced backlash for scenes considered too intense. Some theaters even pulled it after parents complained. Behind the curtain production was difficult. Voice actors recorded separately across continents. The animation team in Japan worked under crushing deadlines. Despite the confusion, it became beloved by fans who discovered it on VHS years later. The Last Unicorn remains one of the strangest and most moving fantasies of the 80s, a film that feels less like a story and more like a forgotten dream whispering about beauty loss and immortality. Haka'akor. Number 2, Flash Gordon, 1980. If any movie defines glorious nonsense, it is Flash Gordon. A rock opera disguised as space adventure, it hurled audiences into a universe ruled by the tyrant Ming the Merciless, where football players battled aliens, and Queen's thundering soundtrack shook the stars themselves. From the first scene, nothing made sense. A football helmet in space, a rocket-powered palace, a villain who shoots lightning from his ring. The dialogue sounded like it was written in another language, then translated by chaos. But no one cared. The colors blazed, the costumes exploded with gold, and every moment felt alive. Behind the scenes, the production was a circus. Dino De Laurentiis wanted it campy, while director Mike Hodges tried to inject sincerity. Actors improvised entire lines because the script changed daily. The film was mocked by critics who could not decide if it was genius or insanity. Audiences, however, could not look away. Flash Gordon failed in America but became a sensation overseas. Musicians, filmmakers, and comic book fans later hailed it as a cult masterpiece. Its influence echoed through decades of pop culture, from music videos to modern superhero movies. Flash Gordon proves that logic is overrated when imagination runs this wild. It is a cinematic explosion that still refuses to age quietly, a reminder that sometimes the best stories are the ones that never make sense. Number 1. Big Trouble in Little China, 1986. At the top of this list stands John Carpenter's Big Trouble in Little China, the ultimate example of 80s fantasy chaos. It was a martial arts, ghost story, action, comedy, and urban myth rolled into one impossible package. Kurt Russell starred as Jack Burton, a truck driver who stumbles into a supernatural war beneath San Francisco's Chinatown. Nothing about it followed logic. Ancient sorcerers battled lightning gods in alleyways. Floating eyeballs spied on heroes. Demons burst from walls. Carpenter described it as an action movie on acid, and that is exactly how it feels. The story twisted through curses, reincarnation, and explosions without ever stopping to explain itself. Production clashed with studio expectations. Executives wanted a serious martial arts epic, but Carpenter leaned into pulp absurdity. The marketing failed, audiences were confused, and critics dismissed it as incoherent. It flopped hard, ending Carpenter's major studio career. But time turned the disaster into legend. Fans rediscovered it on video, marveling at its bizarre mix of genres. It influenced everything from Mortal Kombat to Ghostbusters. Russell's swaggering everyman became iconic. Today, it stands as one of the greatest cult films ever made, a chaotic masterpiece that celebrates confusion as an art form. Big Trouble in Little China is more than fantasy. It is a rebellion against sense itself. It tells us that cinema's wildest dreams come alive only when reason dies. The 80s dared to mix madness with magic, creating worlds that defied gravity, reason, and fear. These films may not have made sense, but they made us feel alive. They remind us that chaos is sometimes the purest form of creativity. Which of these strange journeys haunts you the most? Like, subscribe, and tell us what fantasy world you still dream about.